have 6 students in my class and then Mary Barney brought class.
All right, good morning, everybody. We're going to get started. I want to thank you for coming today to our actually, this is our second Women's History Month event at the college, so thank you for being here. We will be talking today with Kevin Navratil and Mary Fleece, who are both faculty members here in the Political Science Department. They are going to be focusing on the Roe versus Wade decision, but how it has impacted women since the decision last June. So we're going to talk more about kind of what's happened since that decision, what's happening across the country in different states, and how women are being impacted by the decision. So that's kind of the focus of what today's talk will be. We do have another Women's History Month event next week. If anybody is interested, we'll be talking to a woman who is one of 11 women referees in the IHSA soccer program across the state. So she's actually an alum of the college. So it's kind of cool that she went here, and now she's out representing women across the state at IHSA. So that's kind of interesting. That's next week. So anyway, I just want to turn it over to you guys. And what we're kind of hoping for is that this will be a place where we can have a safe discussion. You can feel free to say what you would like to say. We're kind of hoping that it will be a discussion and not just talking at you. So if you have comments or anything, please feel free to raise your hand and we will get the microphone over to you so that you can to share your thoughts with the information that they're presenting.
Great.
So, all right, so take it away, guys.
Do you want to introduce yourself or you're good? Okay, awesome. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, great. My name is Mary Fleece. As Jessica just said, it's lovely to be with all of you here today on this nice spring day. Seems like spring, I think, is making a little return. So I've got a couple of things we want to start off with talking to you about. And as Jess said, Kevin and I are Professor Navratil and I are pretty, well, I probably am more so than he's more professional than I am, but I definitely am pretty casual. So if you have questions, please feel free to, or comments, join in. We really want this to be interactive, and neither of us is threatened by an opinion. So we're definitely up for it. So I just want to kind of start off with a little story. Some of you may have heard this story. How many of you heard of this story about a young girl 10 years old in Ohio this summer who was raped and became pregnant? Can you see a show of hands of how many of you heard that story? So that's a pretty good majority of you. Okay, so she was 10 years old. She was raped and became pregnant, and was not able to get an abortion in the state of Ohio because the reversal of Roe versus Wade had just come down from the Supreme Court, which I'll explain in just a second. She was forced to travel to Indiana, where the law had not yet really shifted because of Ohio's fetal heart rate bill, which basically said that when a fetal heartbeat is detected, which is around 6 weeks, I believe, in Ohio, that they're claiming, they're not able to perform an abortion. So she went to Indiana. The abortion was performed. This is the Dr. Caitlin Bernard, who took care of her and who since has faced considerable threats and pushback. It became a national story, right? Where there was talk about whether or not, was it true, was it not true, et cetera. The assailant was apprehended, and I believe he's now awaiting trial. But she was able to get the abortion, get the procedure done. But it just kind of highlights almost immediately, right? As soon as the case was reversed, this happened like right off the bat and became sort of this flashpoint for everyone to rally around and talk about in the public discourse. So just as sort of a recap, for those of you who may not know, I think a lot of you probably are aware of this, but the decision that was reversed by the Supreme Court this last year in June was the Roe versus Wade decision that goes back to 1973. And it was a decision based on some previous decisions talking about the right to privacy, but basically it was a 7-2 decision. In other words, there are 9 Supreme Court justices, 7 of them ruled that a woman has a right to seek an abortion, basically under the right of privacy. And in the beginning, it was like access in all trimesters, but they did allow basically the idea that states were going to be given leeway to limit it. From then on, states did limit it considerably. Some states more than others. Now, that being said, and I think, again, we don't want to focus too much on what happened, but more kind of, we're going to flash forward here to what happened this past June. The Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health decision in 2022, that basically was a 6-3 decision that essentially overturned these two previous decisions. Oops, oh, what did I just do there? Wow. Oh, there it goes. There it is. Okay, sorry. I used to have this one, but it's been a while since I've used it. Sorry about that. So Roe versus Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey. Planned Parenthood versus Casey had said that basically abortion access can be limited, but it cannot place what they called an undue burden on women. So those two cases were essentially overturned, saying that this is no longer a federal right, meaning that they want to turn it back to states. So if you live in a state where, like Illinois, where there's abortion access, you can life can continue as usual, sort of, which we'll discuss. But if you are in a state where abortion access was already limited, or they had laws in the books that we're going to, which we'll talk about, it was overturned and immediately became illegal. So, and then another thing was that the ruling, some of you may have heard, was leaked before the decision actually was handed down, because that was something that just never happened before. So that just sort of gives us a quick recap of what's going on, and from there we'll start talking about what's going on in our own neck of the woods. Do you want me to pull up the map from here?
I think this is good. It's fine.
Okay, for right now. All right.
So you want to talk about this, right?
Oh, yeah, okay, so I'm sorry. So actually, I think in that case, I think I actually will pull up the map here. But so looking at one of the things that Professor Navratil and I were talking about was the idea of because we were like, which states should we focus on? Where should we focus on? And we were thinking that it might kind of resonate more with all of you if we talked about what's happening closer to home, right? So just like, I don't know if anybody wants to chime in on this. But how many of you are aware or know kind of what's happening in states around us? Does anybody have any idea of what's going on around us? If you were to kind of summarize it, if you could, like in any of the states, what would you say is kind of going on? Is kind of the policy in some of the states around us that you know of? Yes, ma'am.
Illinois is kind of an island of abortion access where everybody else around us, Ohio, Indiana, Missouri, everybody else is trying to restrict it as much as possible.
Ditto, right? Yeah. Anyone else want to add anything that they know of? How many of you were aware of that? Fewer? How many of you had no idea what's been going on kind of around us? Okay. All right. So and there's a truth to this, right? I'm gonna pull up a map in just a second here that shows us kind of what's going on. It's a great map that gives you kind of a snapshot of what's happening in all the different states. But if you're looking at in Illinois, now Illinois is one of the states where it's not like you can. There's kind of this I think this misperception about abortion access, and that they know oftentimes, because you may have heard the term like late-term abortion and terms like that, which are actually not medical terms. They're more political terms, but the idea that, a woman can just go up and, at 38 weeks and be like, yeah, I just decided I want to get an abortion. And in Illinois, it does not work like that. Abortion is banned basically when the fetus is termed to be viable. In other words, when a fetus can possibly live outside the mother's womb, right? So this idea of 24 to 26 weeks, depending upon the situation. And of course, if there are exceptions, based on if there's something really considerably that could hurt that could threaten the life of the mother or the fetus. In the case of Illinois, Medicaid, which is the medical coverage for people who are having a hard time affording medical insurance, covers abortion. In the state of Missouri, it does not cover abortion. So it covers it here in Illinois, and it does not cover it in Missouri. Abortion is completely pretty much banned in Missouri. Now, they say limited exceptions, right? But even those limited exceptions, the burden is placed basically on the provider, right? So that the doctor who's performing the abortion, that meets this criteria for a legal exception. So if you're thinking about this in your mind, if you're kind of the doctor, what do you think that some of these doctors might be thinking if you're a doctor in Missouri and somebody comes to you, and it might be like a real life, a medical emergency? What do you think some of those doctors might be thinking in their minds facing a situation like this? Anyone have an idea? I guess maybe you just put yourself in their shoes. Yeah. They possibly don't want to face jail time and, sorry? If something goes wrong, right? Yeah, thank you. Anybody else? Yes, sir. They don't want to lose their medical license. Absolutely. Anybody else? Yeah, but what you guys said is spot on. Yeah. Malpractice, right? Yeah, so like we're talking about those things at the least, jail, Right, jail time, huge fines, right, as another. So obviously you're going to want to make sure if you're faced with a situation like this, you want to make sure that you dot your I's and you cross your T's and you are set to go. But there have been some situations that we'll be talking about that are kind of murky, where actually they're not really murky in the sense that they're pretty clear cut. But despite the clear cut nature of some of the cases, doctors are still kind of nervous about it. So I'm going to pull up this map here for you all to see this. It's this one, right? Nope. The cut maker one. Here it is. Okay. It's this one, right? Nope. The cut maker one. Here it is. Okay. So this is a map that, and if you any of you are interested in, we could probably provide a link maybe somewhere. Yeah. Somewhere I don't know where, but somewhere we'll provide a link if anyone's interested to be able to see this map, or if you want to even just be able to Google abortion rights or Guttmacher Institute, and this you'll see this map here, which is it's interactive, so you can click on it to say, okay, which states have the most restrictive things, which ones have are a little bit less restrictive, some, etc. Any surprises on here that you see, or anything that you're kind of surprised by, or that you're not surprised by? Surprised that New Mexico is in the very protective one. So if we click on New Mexico, it tells you on here what their policies are, and then what the demographic is, and what the abortion statistics are. So in their case, unlike Missouri, but like Illinois, Medicaid does cover abortion. It's not restricted based on the age of the baby or fetus is developing. And qualified health professionals, not just physicians, can provide abortion. So a nurse practitioner might be able to do that. And they have a shield law. So that basically a doctor or provider is going to be protected basically from investigations from other states, because that's a situation that happened with the case in Indiana and Ohio, where the doctor was there's been talk about the doctor being investigated, and it's become, like I said, kind of a national political case. Anything that you wanted to add, Kevin?
Yeah, if you don't mind pulling that map, the national map back up. One point that I'd just like to highlight is, when you look at a state like Illinois, and as one of the audience members described it as an island, I think that's a good description of it. When we were thinking about all the different aspects of how to cover this event today, one way you could say, oh, well, Illinois is this island of providing more access for women to have the right to choose. So is that completely true? Is there, or maybe a better way of framing that, can you think of any ways in which there has been changes since this past June for a state like Illinois? And I see that North Carolina, this is kind of a really broad coding system, but a lot of people would argue that North Carolina is also kind of an island, considering policies compared to, no, it's fine, compared to Florida and Georgia and some of the other states in the region. So my question is can you think of ways in which, since the Dobbs decision came down, how there has been changes even in the island of kind of more access in states like Illinois or North Carolina? Yeah. Exactly. So just for the recording, in case that wasn't picked up, the idea is that now many people are traveling from all of these states in the region that no longer have access. And so what we're seeing, especially, and I have data from North Carolina, is that wait times are up a couple of weeks. And so that might seem somewhat minimal to some of us, 2 extra weeks of waiting. But keep in mind, this is a really difficult decision that individuals are having to make. The traveling to be able to go to states. And so even for the people in the states like Illinois who may have an unexpected pregnancy that they would like to terminate, they may have to wait longer now because of the Dobbs decision. And one of the things that to keep in mind is that as you are increasing the number of weeks before you potentially terminate this pregnancy, some of the options may no longer be available to you. Typically, it's around 10 weeks where abortion pills are used in about half of all abortions. And those are no longer effective after 10 weeks. So by waiting a couple extra weeks because of these wait times, you may no longer have your preferred method of, ending the pregnancy. So that option might be limited to you. And what some individuals are finding is when they travel to a place like North Carolina, and now that they have these wait times, that some of the procedures are now more invasive than they had planned for. So now you've traveled, hotel room, all the other different costs associated with this. You may now have to do a second visit to come back because the original procedure is no longer available to you to do medication or a less invasive procedure. So that's just one thing to keep in mind of one of the many ways that despite kind of being an island of having more abortion access, that there's still a direct impact on individuals within that state. And of course, there's just the greater burden for those who are having to travel to get to these places.
Right. Yeah, according to Planned Parenthood, this is a statistic quoted in an article, that 1 in 3 women now are having their basically access to abortion, or have lost all or most access to abortion rights. And that obviously, since the decision came down, they've got about 24 states that have where bans have gone into effect. Some of them are still awaiting litigation, but obviously, then if you're in a state like Illinois where you can still get access, but now if there are more and more people that are coming in because they're coming in from states surrounding us, that means that your own access is limited. And let's be honest, we're not even only just talking about, if you're talking about clinics, that Planned Parenthood, despite what people talk about, does not just only provide abortion care. I mean, really, it's like that's probably like the least thing that Planned Parenthood does. Some of you may know, if you're driving up and down LaGrange Road, you may see protesters every once in a while. If you're driving in Orland, kind of there on the side. But that Planned Parenthood location does not provide abortions. That it basically just provides contraception, information for breast exams and women's gynecological and reproductive health. So if you think about it, that could also be putting a burden in general just on other things. So it is, per Professor Nevertell's point, it may also be having an impact on women's health here, whether we realize it or not. I guess the extent of it, we're still kind of realizing that that has not quite come to fruition. So.
What I thought I'd do next is first kind of set up a few ideas that we planned on sharing with you, and then kind of just check in to see if there's questions or any other aspects that you would like us to cover. But one key area that we thought was really important is to cover the access to the abortion pill and how potentially in any day that could be disrupted for the entire country, including these blue islands like Illinois. And again, keeping in mind that approximately half of all abortions occur through the pill. And then we were also going to talk about how many of these states, when we were looking at the map with the most restrictive abortion policies, are really the least prepared for all these increased births that are going to be happening now. And so that's an area we planned on covering. And then how specific medical procedures may also be limited for women as well. So that was our plan. So I just want to check in and see if there's any questions, any comments that we have so far. All right, so I do think this video will be pretty provocative and generate some questions or feedback from you. While Mary pulls that up, do you think we can play it at advanced speed, like 1.25?
Probably.
Let's try it.
Yeah, why not? It's a good idea.
Go ahead. So we're going to play this at a slightly advanced speed, but I'm going to keep my eye out in the audience. If anybody thinks this is too fast, we're happy to slow it down, but we just have so much we want to share today. I think it's easy to follow along at just a slightly
And I'm putting the
increased speed.
captions on, so not to annoy some of you, but I think it might help for some people, so I will have them on here. Oh, and we can't hear. Let's see. Try it again.
Just escape for a second, check that volume.
Oh, it's off. Yeah, there you go. Here, let me. Yeah, thanks. There we go.
No, this is the wrong video anyway. So these are great videos that are free on PBS. We have these advertisements. Sorry.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yep, got it. So it goes in front of the next one. Got it. Okay.
Just thought we'd start off with any questions or reactions, thoughts regarding all of the potential implications from what was portrayed in the video. Yeah, Caitlin?
This is a super good question.
It's a great question, and from my understanding, I've watched this video a few times. So the question was, procedurally, what was their legal rationale for saying that the approval of the drug was not consistent with their typical practice of approving drugs? And from my understanding, what they were saying in the video is, from their legal case, is that they're saying that it was originally approved for emergency medications and that it wasn't applicable to that. And somebody else may have to help me out here with.
Wasn't it for something else too? Was it originally approved for ulcers? Like I
Also,
mentioned?
yeah, for a different type of medical procedure.
And beyond that, I think because we're not physicians and nurses, I don't know if I'm not familiar myself with the FDA's like approval process, but I think we can both say that it's safely that it's done with scientific methods and it's done with people that are experts in the field. So that's actually a really good question. I don't know how much science really had to do with that decision, but I'd be curious to find that out myself. Really, kind of how they arrived at that. Yeah. So
I just I struggle here. I'm trying to be an objective conveyor of information, but it's hard to not see this as a very calculated legal case. I mean, this organization set up headquarters in Amarillo, Texas. None of them had any connection to the state. They did this. They set up their headquarters there to have the ability for this particular judge, Kazmarek, to potentially be the one deciding this. And as the video has portrayed and as medical research, I mean, this drug is less harmful or deadly than Tylenol, of Viagra, of actually being pregnant, right? So there's always the slight potential for there to be harm from anything, but when that harm is less than actually being pregnant or from Viagra, which I don't hear any lawsuits about the process of that being. You see where I'm going with this? It's hard to not be a little skeptical of the legal rationale here.
I'm glad that, I don't know if anybody has another question, because that was a really good question. I'm glad that you said that actually, Kevin, because it's one of those issues I know I can't be objective on it myself at all, because it's and I know people have, it doesn't mean that I also cannot try to understand somebody else's point of view, because I try very hard to always put myself in other people's shoes. And I don't think that I think that they genuinely believe that they are trying to protect women and try to protect their health. I think they think they're doing the right thing. I just think I always go back to, in my own mind, the issue to me always circles back to prevention. If you don't want women to be accessing abortions, then why don't we talk more about prevention? When you talk more about prevention, though, there's always talk about states like that using like abstinence-only education and teaching sex ed. Those states that seem to push abstinence-only education also have the highest rates of teen pregnancy. So if abstinence only worked, if it worked really well, it would work, right? But it doesn't. So I always feel like I wish that there was common ground that we could kind of find with one another on the idea of promoting more the idea of safe sex and contraception and teaching people, right? I just want to ask a question that may seem a little unorthodox here. And if you're willing to raise your hand on this, how many of you believe that when abortion is being performed, that a scalpel is involved? That when an abortion is being performed, that a scalpel is involved? How many of you are not sure really what happens? That's probably a better question. Okay, thank you for saying that, because I think one of the misconceptions, and I'm not here trying to say like I'm sitting out here promoting abortions. I don't want you to go home and say, oh, my professor was talking about abortion promotion. But just to give you an idea of, like, in terms of like the safety of the procedure, because a lot of over the years, a lot of these reasons that are given, like the medication thing, or like having laws that state that in an abortion clinic, that the walls of the abortion clinic have to be a certain length wide to accommodate if there's an emergency, right, for the woman who's having the procedure. That sounds like super reasonable, right? You hear that and you're like, okay, that sounds fine. A stretcher has got to come in. There's got to be room for emergency services, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Has anyone here ever had a colonoscopy? A couple of us had, right? If you've ever had a polyp with a colonoscopy, a scalpel is involved when removing a polyp. So you have a greater chance of having a bleeding episode and perhaps going to the hospital with a colonoscopy in the immediate, like after, like right then and there, right? Because I'm not gonna say that there's that a woman also cannot bleed with an abortion, but that usually does. But I'm saying right then and there, a scalpel is used when performing a colonoscopy if you're having a polyp removed. So the idea of it being simply about safety, then why are colonoscopies allowed to be performed in doctors' offices? And they don't talk about how wide the walls have to be or whether the doctor's got privileges to go to the local hospital. It's not regulated the same way that this is regulated, right? So I think that Professor Navratil's right. There is an agenda clearly, and again, I can't talk about their motive. I think the motivation really is pure at heart, but it doesn't deny the fact that women, I think, at the end of the day, end up suffering as a result of it.
Well, and just to be clear, in the video, the leader of the Alliance for Defending Freedom was asked if there's any scientific evidence or data that would persuade her, and she said no. I mean, there isn't any new data we can come up with to alleviate her intent on taking away that form of medication. And again, I think it's a very strategic play. And so I just want to make sure that we're all understanding this. So this is in Texas. Why does it matter to us in Illinois, potentially? And Hardy, please. Correct. So one way is that anything that happens in a state like Texas could lead to more of the patients from Texas going to other states.
Mm-hmm.
Why else? Sir, yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Here, you know what? Yeah, leave it. I'll start coming around with the microphone for people.
So just to recap what was said, that a precedent would be set for what happens in one state for a model for the nation.
So from my understanding, I'm just doing this based off an assumption, and from what I've seen, a couple years ago, a lot of people migrated from Illinois to Texas, because a lot of people seem, at least from my observation, a lot of people have family in Texas and have been moving and all these other things. Yeah, mostly taxes. So what I'm starting to see now is we're actually getting a mass migration back to Illinois from Texas, and already we have a very dense region up here. So I guess we're going to have possibly a big migration issue soon because, I mean, do we have the housing? Do we have the land to accommodate all the people that are now going to move here because of the restriction of this bill?
So the concern for how there could be many people moving from states. One thing to keep in mind is just there's certainly some people who have that capability to take policies into consideration and uproot their family, maybe change jobs, schools, all that. It takes a lot of resources too. And so thinking about the people who may not have those resources or the freedom to potentially change jobs or uproot their family from all the connections that they may have in their neighborhood and in their region. So one of the concerns there is just how many people get left behind in these in those situations. But I still think there's a really big elephant in the room here of how this impacts everybody. And I know there's still multiple hands. Mary, did you want to respond? Yeah.
Well, it's a FDA ruling, so it's going to affect everyone. It's not going to just affect Texas.
100%. This is, we recap, over half of all abortions are through medication. They're removing the key medication that is used in this two-step process. If this goes through, and it's going to be appealed, you know, but if it goes through, that's nationwide, right? So this impacts everybody, and that is over half of all abortions that are currently occur is through this two-step medication process. Caitlin?
I had a question regarding with Jacob's question. If more people move from like Texas who kind of believe in this stance, can they also advocate it for here in Illinois and create more of an issue? And it kind of like, let's say it rockets onwards, because Chicago's a pretty densely democratic city, but the rest of Illinois is not regarded as democratic, it's regarded as more Republican. So can that kind of domino effect surrounding cities of Illinois and then cause Chicago to be an outlier and then cause Illinois to then have more restrictions to abortion?
Interesting. I do think one of the things that we've seen in the last couple of years is the migration of people, and Jacob brought this up, of people going from Illinois to Texas and people from New York to Florida. And, you know, I'm a political scientist. As an election observer, you notice how the 2022 elections, there was some really surprising findings of states like Florida becoming much more red. It used to be a battleground state that was like 50-50 in the 2000 election between Bush and Gore. Obama won it in 2008 and 2012, and now it's like 18% Republican advantage for this governor and Senate race. And you see the flip of that going on in states that used to be really hotly contested in places like Colorado. So I do think you're seeing these migration patterns of kind of, let's say, the liberals of Texas moving to liberal states and the conservatives and blue states moving. But again, these are kind of on the margins. You know, not everybody has that capacity.
And it would take a while, right, for that to, and I'm not saying it couldn't happen, but I think it would, yeah, it would take a while. And conversely, you're seeing now, right, like Georgia, Arizona, some of the states. So we are seeing like kind of some migration it happening, but yeah, I think it would have to take a lot of people for that really to make such an impact on Illinois. It's a good question.
So going off of what you guys said with how people would feel based off of this act, I personally wouldn't know how other people would feel, but based off of what I would feel, right now I do feel a little scared due to the fact that it's a right being taken away. And I am a woman, you know, and hearing this is basically, I feel frightened. What else is being taken away? What else can be taken away?
Yeah.
We've been fighting so long to get stuff in place, and it's just concerning.
Definitely. It's kind of you know, when you ask people, the idea that my husband and I were, this is an anecdotal contribution here. We were talking about this, and I said something to the effect of, I think it's hard for, when people are empathetic, they can, I think, put themselves in somebody else's shoes and understand it. But it's hard unless most people, unless you've had a right taken away from you. I mean, when that actually happens, it's you know, I think it puts you in a completely different mind space. And you think about things that are fundamental to our daily lives that we take for granted. And I think this is one of those things that I think for many, many people, men and women, right, we haven't really thought of, but that once it's been taken away now, it's a very scary thing. So I can completely, I agree with you 100%.
I have a microphone coming.
And did you have your hand up at the front too? Did you have your hand up as well?
You mentioned people not having like the financial freedom to, you know, change jobs and like change locations into a state where it would be, you know, they have abortion rights. this just dawned on me right now. A lot of those states where it's most restrictive, they have like the lowest minimum wage per state, and they don't have the best welfare programs. So how are they really like expected
Pardon me? Yeah,
like
yeah.
families to take care of like themselves?
Which one? The big map? Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point.
So it's the New York Times website.
No.
Yeah, that's a great observation. And, it kind of a natural segue into what we were talking about earlier. So if we would just want to say, this is a generalization here, but when we say red states and blue states, red states that generally vote Republican, and many of these states are in the South and Midwest. And when you look at them collectively, these are the states with the most abortion restrictions. And
it's our map
Mary,
too.
you have that pointer. Can you go back up for a minute?
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, here you go.
So on this left hand, maybe get a little bit higher just so we can see the headings here.
Sure.
But these are the states. I know this is kind of small for you to see, and in fact, I can't quite see it myself. But what I do know is that these states over here are the 24 states that are red, that are the most restrictive. And so, the varying estimates here of approximately 50,000 additional births than previous years from the decision of Dobbs this summer. So there's an expectation that there's going to be approximately 50,000 births that wouldn't have occurred before. And so these are not going to occur equally distributed across the country, right? It's more likely to be in these 24 states that have more abortion restrictions. And so to your point, if you look at whether children living in poverty, a big increase over the states that are like Illinois that have better access to abortion rights, uninsured women. This is a huge issue in terms of access to medical care, prenatal care, and then uninsured children. It's twice as high. Low birth rate babies is higher. Teen births is almost twice as high. Infant mortality is higher. Maternal mortality is higher. I mean, so the impact is significant of the impact that it's going to have on, and this is just thinking about, years ahead of how this plays out. Now, there's certainly always those cases. I remember the Republican National Convention, I think, highlighted somebody who, their parents were planning on having an abortion and they didn't, and here they are. And, I'm not trying to say that there's not those stories of like, oh, they're just so happy to have this baby that they didn't plan and they were going to have an abortion and they didn't. But there's going to be a lot of scenarios where just either a single parent or family is just not prepared to have this child. And unfortunately, several of these states have not proven themselves to really devote the resources that is necessary to families who are in need of care and assistance, whether that's medical care, whether that's financial assistance, housing assistance, and so forth. So I think there's a real concern of how this is going to play out, not just in the short term, but how these kids are going to fare 18 years from now.
Sure. And to your very good point, if someone at a higher socioeconomic level, right, is in Texas or they're in Alabama or they're in Mississippi or wherever it may be, they're more likely, in anecdote after anecdote is already bearing this out, they can afford to get on a plane and go somewhere or drive somewhere and get childcare and get for the kids they may already have, right, or to take leave from their job and get a hotel and stay there. They have the resources to do that. Who is this going to impact the most? It's going to be people who already cannot afford it, which is going to further burden a system that is already burdened. In a lot of states that do not also accept expansion of Medicaid benefits, where they can least afford it. So it's going to end up impacting people who are already impoverished and just drive them further into poverty. Unfortunately, you guys, kids are expensive. I joke around to my stepkids, you guys are like, the succubus, like just kind of, as much as we love you, right? But all of us were at one time, right? We were succubi to our parents at one point. It happens, right? But it's expensive, right? To raise kids the way you want and to give them the things that you want to give them. And that's just a truth. So it was a good question. You had a question here? You want me I can give you mine. Troy's coming.
What disturbs me the most about this whole thing is that they claim to be wanting to protect women and children, and yet these statistics show you that they don't care about women and children. If you've got a 25% maternity death rate for people who don't have access to this, you know, you have children who are living in a higher poverty rate, who are uninsured. They don't care about children. You know, they're just obsessed with everybody else having sex, and they're not. I don't know. I mean,
no,
it's
it
like,
is.
why are you
Yeah,
so
I would
obsessed
agree.
with someone else's bedroom?
Yeah.
Get out of my bedroom, get out of my doctor's office, and pay attention to your own stuff.
I would definitely agree with the idea that there's sometimes with the first part. Going back to your previous point about what was the first point that you made? I'm sorry, because I had something I wanted to say. I just totally left my head. Sorry. Go ahead. I'll let you talk first. We're going to add something. I just totally lost my thought because I had something I wanted to add to that.
About not caring about women and children. That was what my first point was.
Why
It's hard
Mary
to say
thinks
that.
of her comment, you know, I was just going to say, I do think that there has been a few organizations, you know, the pro-life organizations that have agreed to step up funding. And I can't cite the article or the example of which group it is, but I've seen a couple and I'm like, okay, that's kind of putting your money where your mouth is. But it's definitely too few, and it isn't at the state level of being prepared for, let's say, a Mississippi to say, you know what, we're going to increase you know, Medicaid coverage in anticipation that we're going to have more births now. So you're definitely right. There isn't that commitment there to say we're not just pro-life. We're going to make sure that with the fetus that we're going to make sure that we're going to support that born baby for the rest of their life. So another concern is the strain on our social services. The foster system in 2020 had 600,000 students in the foster care system. And 100,000 of them were waiting to be adopted. And so you know, again, the kind of the potential additional number of kids in the foster care system. So, you know, I'd like to see is some of these, you know, the woman from that organization, I would hope that her organization's doing a lot to try to promote adoption through the foster care system and putting their money where their mouth is in terms of being pro-life.
I'm sorry, and I remembered my what I was going to say. Thank you. Not to mention the fact that we do have in the industrialized world one of the highest maternal mortality rates and infant mortality rates. So, and we also have the highest child poverty rate in the industrialized world, about a 30% poverty rate amongst children. So that's, I mean, that in of itself is kind of a frightening statistic. So, and your chances of dying in childbirth are far greater than dying from an abortion provided. Again, that's not their concern. And I do like to think that some people genuinely have people's best interest at heart. They just don't. I think they're not able to get. They're only seeing their own tunnel. They're not able to see.
They're
what's
seeing it
best
in their
for
own
everybody
black
else.
and white perspective, and
Yes.
not all the shades of gray that are in
Right.
between.
Right. Exactly.
I see Caitlin has her hand up, and while we're getting to her, I'll just point out that that maternal mortality rate, I can't say it, has only increased this last couple of years during COVID.
Yeah.
And we also have to understand that with these data kind of mask the differences we see based on race and based on income, right? So low income minority mothers are much higher, and that has actually increased significantly in the last couple of years. So we're going the wrong direction.
I kind of want to point on her point about like how it's like a really interesting conversation of like how they're kind of pointing it out. But I feel like sometimes this conversation could be like, I think I would have a different reaction to this conversation if we had like better maybe education for our youth on like contraceptive wise, maybe different like ways of like supporting families, like having better education systems, like having more like free daycares for children. And it kind of makes me think about in Asia, a lot of Asian countries has this system like for mothers, like after they give birth, to help with like post-depression and supporting them and like taking care of them before they take care of their babies. Like they have like a separate ward where they'll take care of their mothers, and then nurses will come and take care of the children while the mothers just kind of focus on re-healing themselves after pregnancy. And it makes me think of like post-depression here in the US and how post-depression is such a serious issue and we do not talk about it very
100%.
much. And it really does affect the children and what happens to the children afterwards, because sometimes post-depression moms just don't have the correct mindset at that time due to post-depression.
You've raised a number of awesome points. Yeah, again, the sex education point, I think, is number one. We had a discussion, actually, Jessica, Kevin, and I, about even having another event, because I was talking about, and I think I've talked about this, Julia, in our sociology class, too, just about the idea that we don't talk about these topics enough. They're very taboo, right? We want to, it's interesting that this nice lady here in the front row, and forgive me, I don't know your name, talked about the idea of intervening in people's bedrooms, but we're kind of okay with doing that, but we're not comfortable talking about this conversation openly. Scandinavian countries, they have these conversations very, very openly, with a frankness that would probably shock most Americans. We'd be like very uncomfortable about it. But talking about, like, how much did your parents talk about it with you, right? Talk about sex with you and talk about contraception and have these conversations. And it's embarrassing, right? Nobody wants to talk to your parents about that. So I totally get that. But that's one major problem that we have. If we're not talking about it, then we can't educate people about it. And the lack of knowledge when you quiz not just teenagers, right? Adults even, on what they know or they do not know about sex and how a person can get pregnant or get a venereal disease is appalling, because we don't have these conversations. To your other point about postpartum depression, I'm very, very happy that you brought that up. I was sitting in a car dealership yesterday talking to a man who happened to be from France, and he's been living here for a few years now, and he was saying that he just cannot get over, he and his wife have 3 children, and how he just can't get over how in France, you're given support for a year. The mother can stay home with the baby, and then the father's given also paternity leave as well to be at home, and then from there, at 3 years old, all kids have basically mandatory preschool. Everybody basically has to go. Rich, poor, everybody, middle class, you all go. And it's with a very good curriculum, but the idea is so that kids get socialized and that parents can then return to the workforce. So all of those things that we don't have in place, right, for mental health and behavioral health, and that we're seeing at an alarming rate here, that the pandemic only exacerbated, those are major points that we need to address, 100%. And if you just watching the news yesterday or the day before, I think it was maybe yesterday, President Biden had the White House. If any of you watched Ted Lasso on Apple TV, the cast of Ted Lasso, and they talk on that show, besides just talking about soccer, right, football in Europe, they talk a lot about mental health. That's one of the great things about that show. It's one of the only shows I've ever seen that talks about that. So I'm glad to see that there's at least a conversation that's starting, but we need to go a lot deeper on that conversation.
No, I just appreciate the comments, Caitlin. You know, we are essentially one of the only countries in the world without any paid leave, paid family leave. And, you know, we have 12 weeks of unpaid leave, which is basically not an option for most people. You know, over half of Americans live paycheck to paycheck, don't have more than $400 in their bank account. And I was just thinking back to when my daughter was born, and you know, we were in the hospital for a couple days before, and she was born at 5:30 in the morning, and you're just exhausted, and to have to, you know, in that case, I had a summer class, but you know, to have to go teach a summer class within a few days, you know, those poor students didn't get the same version of me. I didn't get the same version to my wife or daughter, and it makes me sad. And I'm somebody of means, and there's certainly a lot of people in much different scenarios than me, and we're not giving families the head start and the strong start that they deserve.
Yeah, it's a great question. Other questions? Or comments?
So I just wanted to follow up with what can happen regarding the illegal activities when the pill will be banned. So if someone wants to go ahead and have an abortion, they will find a way to do it.
Mm-hmm.
But the way will be unsafe, underground, and will cause more harm for the females who decide to go for it.
Right, right. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%, Kasha. It's definitely a concern, and you know, when we were talking about this scenario with the 2 forms of medication, if the second of which is stopped even temporarily, you know, the World Health Organization has approved just the first form of medication, but it's only 80% effective. And I think you're exactly right that, you know, the video was talking about there's more side effects negative side effects to the mother when taking just the one birth form of medication. And I think there's definitely individuals, as you know, even now with some of these states that are very restrictive, who are unfortunately going to be taking actions into their own hands. You know, because again, we haven't fundamentally solved this issue of people having unplanned births who are unprepared for them. And so we may think we have solved a problem by changing really restrictive policies at the state level, but there's still going to be a lot of implications for this.
Yeah, definitely.
Underground medical kind of businesses where the goal of this business is to make money, not to take care of the women who wants to eliminate the birth. Very often they don't get to go when the pill works. They don't have access to the pill, and there are performed different surgeries, and the result, unfortunately, is the mom who dies and who have several kids already at home, which is really sad.
And that's so often a scenario that's facing women. It's not always necessarily, you know, there's often talk about, unfortunately, and you hear it very often, but talk about the promiscuousness of a person, and oftentimes that women who are finding themselves in this scenario, they have children already at home, and if you're facing, and this is kind of segueing into what we were also going to talk about, but just this idea of what's kind of happening already, but women who are facing medical issues where either their life is possibly threatened or that of their child. When a woman's at a point where she's at, let's say, 20 weeks or 22 weeks or 23 weeks or 20, you know, beyond that, right, in the second or even, God forbid, the third trimester, people at that point, they're picking out baby names, they have cribs, they have, you know, they're people that want their children. So when something like this that's catastrophic that happens, it's because there's something catastrophic happening and they need such a procedure. So if they're going to be delayed further, where they may have to go, and again, there's a case that just developed, was it last week, Kevin, we were talking about the one in Texas where there's now a lawsuit being brought about against, because of a woman who basically they had to wait till she almost died, essentially, and had to perform a hysterectomy on her because she became septic and developed a fever, and because they could not perform the procedure because the doctor was too afraid to perform a procedure on her, even though he said, I mean, he knew that she needed this procedure to be done because her life was at risk. But they just could not, he was unwilling to, he couldn't get the backing of other doctors at the hospital because they were afraid of all those things that you guys mentioned before, of possible legal ramifications, going to jail, losing your license, et cetera, et cetera. And obviously the idea of doctors also leaving states and going elsewhere. An article that was in I think it was the Guardian one, yeah, the Guardian, talked about that in Texas that nearly half of all counties lack a single obstetrician. Yeah, nearly half the counties in Texas, and Texas is a pretty big state. So if you have to drive 8 hours to get an obstetrician to get, you know, care, you know, you're going to be in some trouble. It's pretty tough. Question? Is it Caitlin? Oh, yeah, sorry. Wait for the microphone. Thank you.
So going back on her point, it kind of made me think of like, well, if people go through underground means of getting abortion and then they come back, they're fine, but then later on in life they see that they have issues, wouldn't that put a strain on our already strained health care system?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Or if you have to have a hysterectomy and you weren't planning to have one, have to have your uterus removed and you weren't planning to have it removed, it's a pretty traumatic thing. Even if you're expecting it, it can be a pretty traumatic thing. So if you're not expecting it, because you had a procedure that would have enabled you to have more kids later on, but because it was delayed because of that, it's pretty awful.
To Mary's point, there's an article that Mary found that we were using to prepare for this, and just so if you're interested in it, it's called "Doctors Are Leaving Anti-Abortion States. I Couldn't Do My Job at All," is the title of the article. It's in The Guardian on October 26, 2022. And they highlight 6 different doctors, and they're all just really tough to read. But this one in particular was talking about a doctor in Texas whose couple had a pregnancy, was not going to be viable, came to him for care, but because of Texas's abortion ban, he had to send them hundreds of miles away. The mother was 21 weeks pregnant with identical twins. They shared one placenta. one of the twins was almost certainly going to die, which most likely would have killed the other twin without intervention. The doctor wanted to use a selective life-saving procedure. By stopping the blood flow to the unhealthy twin, he could have saved the other's life. In Texas, he didn't have that option. They were just crying. They needed to get to the East Coast or West Coast, find a doctor, and they couldn't do it in the next 24 to 48 hours.
Yeah. You said
The
there wasn't
doctors
much
are
we could
leaving
do.
these states. And so the people left behind will have some fewer options for some of the best doctors too.
Yeah. And that I pulled it up here. That article is filled with, if anyone want to Google it and look it up, but it's filled with some anecdotes from Ohio, Texas. This is an abortion provider that was in Ohio that basically, I think this is the lady that actually stopped doing that too, and she's now doing, I believe, psychiatric care. She left because she could no longer be an obstetrician. But she talks about a patient in Indiana who found out she was pregnant on her first day of the abortion. Abortion was illegal in Indiana. In the time it took the patient to drive to Ohio, then back to Indiana for her mandatory 24-hour waiting period. Then back to Ohio again for the abortion. The ban in Indiana had been temporarily lifted. So just running, driving around in circles. And again, it's not just that, right? It's the psychological impact. It's if you already have other kids, you're taking off from work to do these things. It's a lot. There's a lot more to it than that, and that's just trauma. I'd like to recommend to some of you, especially to those who are younger, because this is something that I think I've always grown up with, and Kevin, our generation, Jess, we've all grown up with kind of having these, not kind of taking these things for granted. Maybe if any of you has HBO Max, look up a documentary called The Janes, like Jane, like the name Jane, The Janes, and it's about a group of women who basically were kind of risking prison and other to get abortion access for women who needed it. And this was in the late 60s, early 70s. And it's very powerful. It's talking about how basically they were performing kind of like what Kasha was talking about, these sort of like, I guess you call them back alley abortions, but they were as safe as possible. They were under as safe circumstances as they could possibly provide. But the method that they were doing it and how women would call and before they had an answering machine, they couldn't call them back, right? Or if a person didn't leave their phone number because they were scared, they couldn't call them back. So who knows how many people they weren't able to help. But it's very, it was kind of hard to watch, to be honest with you, in this aftermath of of Roe v. Wade being overturned. So not to depress you further, but it was also, though, I think something that it's really important for people to see too. Was there another story that you wanted to? Let's see the one. This is another one of a woman that was in Georgia, a doctor who then went to Missouri, and then went to Tennessee, and then basically this might be the person that actually stopped doing it. Yeah, she's a maternal fetal medicine specialist. So I mean, it's just like she's kind of ready to. I think this is maybe the lady. Oh yeah, she's going to Colorado. Yeah. So she says she feels relieved to be starting over in a new state where I'm not going to be under a microscope, that someone isn't going to turn me into the cops or show up at my house and arrest me for doing my job. So,
yeah. I mean, there's a lot of these stories. There's an article in the New York Times called "A New Goal for Abortion Bills: Punish or Protect Doctors," and in one example, so we wanted to tell you about all the changes that are happening at the state level, and it's hard to keep track. There's like literally 400 bills that are being proposed, so a bill has to go through both the House and Senate at the state level and it's signed into law by the governor. So a lot of these are just in different phases right now, but of one example that physicians would face penalties of up to 7 years in prison and a fine of $100,000. And they're hearing from doctors in hospitals that are already short-staffed who are worried about recruitment. He's like, and this is a direct quote in the article, "You can't go to jail for screwing up an appendectomy."
Yes. Great.
That's the thing that gets me. If somebody will show me where there's other types of surgeries that a doctor can do and send you to jail, please let me know.
Yeah.
So again, it's just the total impact through the medical system that is already struggling, I'd say, to put it mildly.
And Wyoming did pass Kevin and I were talking over the weekend, Wyoming actually did pass a bill. I think it was the first state now to actually outlaw the pills, the abortion pills. If I pull it up here, it was just over the weekend, I believe this occurred.
Right, and so there's also Walgreens, and it's that stopped providing mifepristone. I'm sorry with my pronunciation. I practice. Can't get it. Swear.
Mifepristone.
Yeah, thank you. Right in what was that, 18 states where they
Yeah.
stopped making it available in Walgreens. So obviously there's other pharmacies, but you're already seeing certain businesses kind of cave into the pressure. So maybe that's your preferred place to go to when you're, and so now that's not an option to you. So
Yeah, I kind of voted with my
we're
feet on
down
that
to
one.
like 4 minutes here, and that we'd see if there's any other questions and comments.
Jacob? Oh, if we wanted to. Now that we've thoroughly depressed you.
So now that we have this information, now that we've been educated on it, question now is what will we do with it? Like, what's the next step? What should we do? Because as Americans, we have that voice in our government, right? We get to choose who we elect. We get to choose. We get to, we could go out and like march, and we could do whatever. So what would be the next best thing to ensure that, because this is a woman's right, how would we protect it?
Do you mind if I say something?
You go first. Please go first.
Okay. Okay, so I can't speak for anybody else. I can only tell you what I did. So this is one thing I did that my husband's still laughing at me about, but I did it anyway. I actually pulled my prescriptions out of Walgreens. I've used Walgreens my whole life, and it's kind of upsetting me because I use it. It's my one-stop shop for a lot of things, but I'm like, I got to put my money where my mouth is, and so I actually switched over to a local pharmacy in Orland Park that will deliver to me. So I'm like, I'm gonna make that switch, just because. Again, we could have a whole other conversation about the corporatization, the politicization of corporations. But I think that's one way that I personally have decided to do something. But obviously there's many ways that you can make your voice heard. It's easy, I think, in a state like Illinois, where we still have these benefits, to become kind of complacent. But I think I would also say that the best thing you could do is also just stay informed. That's probably the easiest thing that you could do. Keep reading about these things, and just kind of keep it, and so that you can tell other people about them. Tell maybe your friends about them who don't know about it, and inform them so that they know. And then maybe they'll tell somebody else too, and it just has that ripple effect. And obviously, when it comes time to vote and be involved, know how your politicians know where they stand on issues. And vote accordingly based on how you believe on the issue, right? And how you think they're going to be voting on it. That's probably the best thing I could say, at least in the short term.
Yeah, I think there's just a whole bunch of ways to get involved politically, and I don't think we should get too complacent with Illinois, with the way governor's elections can go. Yep. And so it's always to get involved locally first. But I also just getting involved in some of these battleground states that just happen to share a border with us, like Wisconsin. We're the 2016 election is why we're in this situation, right? I mean, we had a president win by losing the popular vote by a couple million votes, who was able to nominate 3 Supreme Court members. And as Mary pointed out, Roe v. Wade was decided 7-2. There's like 4 or 5 Republican-appointed Supreme Court members who gave the right to abortion. And so this has been a recent change. And I think that getting involved, making Senate elections in places like Wisconsin and battleground states, the last 2 elections for president have been decided by less than 80,000 votes. The control of the House of Representatives has been decided by 5,000, 6,000 votes this last election. Both parties have had a 5-vote majority in the House the last 2 elections. We're basically at a 50-50 Senate. So, I mean, it's kind of getting involved. And I don't know, we're limited in money, so it isn't like you're not going to write some $10,000 check, but you can write letters. There's all kinds of organizations where you can write letters to voters to urge them to vote. I also just really think that the Supreme Court, as isolated as they are, they can respond to public I don't say protests, but movements of people. This is not okay. I mean, this is the way that this is the changes that we've seen just in the Dobbs case was over whether Mississippi should have restrictions at 15 weeks. They never needed to completely overturn Roe v. Wade. That was judicial activism. They could have just, the case was dealing with whether Mississippi could have restrictions at 15 weeks instead of 22 weeks. They decided to overturn Roe v. Wade. I think they assumed the public would be more complacent, and they so I think that they would respond to seeing people acting in movements and protests and getting out on the streets and showing your displeasure.
And we're already seeing, the question, we're already seeing, I just want to say something positive too. I mean, in states where, a state like Kansas, right? Where it's you wouldn't argue it's a bastion of blueness, right? It's a pretty red state where they rejected an abortion ban. Michigan, so when voters are being given the chance to make that decision, just to kind of inject a little bit of positivity, they're making their voices heard, because overwhelmingly public opinion, regardless of what we say, is very much, it's irrespective of red or blue, seems to be pro-choice on this matter. Whether you think about it personally or not, overwhelmingly is pro-choice. You have another last comment or question?
Just sharing information. So Orland Park's election is to do the election, it's April 4th. That's the official election.
Yeah.
But you can go vote right now.
Yes.
And right now up for candidacy is mayor for Orland Park and mayor.
Yes.
And I think the Orland Park consolidated like I don't know the proper term, but like
the referendum that they're talking about right now?
Huh?
The referendum that they're discussing right now, is that what you were talking about?
Oh no, it was like their school board. They're
School
like
board,
Got-
yeah.
Okay.
so maybe it's like right now would be a great way to like kind of look at the candidacy and see who are going to advocate for this. Right now for the school board, I think I haven't seen the candidates, so I don't know their viewpoints or anything. But I think if you see like a candidate who views like education for prevention of pregnancy, it would be a great way to do it for our school districts and too.
Yeah.
So that's some information.
Yeah,
Thank you, Caitlin. Thank you all for being here today.
It's a great panel.
Yeah.
Great comments, I should say. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks, you guys. I'm like, we're such a great panel. We're so awesome. But these are great comments. I was very impressed with the comments. Can we just say one more time how awesome we are? Those awesome comments. Thank you very much for your input. Thank you, Jess. No, thank you. It's good. It's a good thing. Thank you so much. Hi, I'm Mary. Oh, hi. How are you? Nice to meet you. I'm going to put a face with a name. Right, exactly. It's awesome. That's awesome. Thank you for what you're saying. I had so many things I wanted to say.